Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tahir Duckett. I'm the Executive Director here at Georgetown Law's Center for Innovations in Community Safety, and I am so excited for this afternoon's conversation. I am joined by three powerhouses who are gonna just have a nice, casual afternoon chat. It's maybe 1 hour short of happy hour, but we're gonna try to have a little bit of a happy hour vibe about it to try to talk about community safety here in the district. It is obviously a really, really interesting time to be a district resident and an advocate here in DC. There is obviously been an enormous amount happening nationwide this year, an enormous amount of um, honestly, quite honestly, traumas that have kind of come through our cities over the course of much of the last few years, and at the same time, there is turnover in leadership, uh, and as we are dealing with all of these traumas and all of these kind of awful external things. We're also seeing just incredible organizing and advocacy and movement. And so I am hopeful that we can, the four of us here, solve all of the problems that are facing the district over the course of the next 58 minutes. And let me stop there. Okay, so I have with me here Kylie Hogan from DC Safe. Um, Rebecca Atkinson from John Jay College, and Jesse Henry from Pathways. Can I ask each of you to give me like just a quick 60 seconds on like who you are and why you are like part of this conversation? Kylie, can I pick on you to go first?
Sure, why not? So thanks for the introduction. I am the Director of Systems Advocacy for DC Safe. I've been with them for 11 years, working in the domestic violence field for about 15. I think why in community safety, I don't think it will be any surprise to anybody that, especially at the moment, we have seen community violence numbers really go down and seen some real success fighting that. And domestic violence numbers persist, if not get worse. I think we also know that domestic violence doesn't stay in the home. If you look at histories of mass shootings, things like that, it is something that absolutely breaks out and can impact people across the board. And it's something that, despite talking about it for a really long time, I don't think we still have a lot of answers on how to address it. I think we obviously in the victim service spaces do a lot of work in trying to meet those needs. Um, but alternatives to the police going out or how to serve people who might be doing harm, is still a big open question and something that needs to be uplifted and discussed.
Great. Thanks so much, Kylie. Rebecca?
Thanks. It's good to be with you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I am the Programs and Partnerships Director for the Future of Public Safety Initiative at John Jay College, and I've been in this role for about 3.5 years. The mission of our initiative is to support communities as they stand up or continue to invest in community-driven approaches to public safety. And so I come to this work both as a Ward 6 resident but also as somebody who was pulled into work on the blueprint. I'm just very excited about reimagining and rethinking what a holistic approach to community safety looks like in the district. So just really excited to be here.
Amazing. And more on that blueprint in just a moment. Jesse.
Yeah, hi everyone. Excited to be here as well. My name is Jessie Henry. I am the VP of Homeless Services at Pathways to Housing. We're a nonprofit that works with individuals who are sleeping on the street, or we help move into housing as well. I oversee all of our low barrier uh, our low barrier program. So anyone who's outside on the street in downtown DC or Northeast, our team engages with. And so like when we have encampment closures and a lot of hostility has always been shown towards the unhoused community, but even more so in recent months. And so trying to figure out how we can really change that. Also, we have a client whose cat we're watching as an office right now. So if you see a cat in the background, yes, we are taking care of her for a little bit. So please ignore that.
Wonderful. No, we'll just have a fifth person,
Yes.
fifth guest with us on the webinar. Rebecca mentioned the blueprint, which is maybe a helpful place to get started. So, over the course of the last 9 months, the Center for Innovations in Community Safety, which we call CICS for short, has undertaken this process to really start to try to understand what the district needs in order to build safer neighborhoods. And we started with this sort of anchor and crisis response. For the last several years, we've been working with jurisdictions across the country that have started to transform the ways in which they send individuals to respond to people who are in crisis. And jurisdictions like Albuquerque and Durham, where their HEART program and Albuquerque Community Safety and Denver Star and a lot of these programs that you might have seen show up in the news. And um, we were trying to look at why isn't this kind of thing happening in the district? And I think over the course of having these conversations, we had a lot of conversations about crisis and about who responds to 911 calls when people are in crisis, 988 calls when people are in crisis. But what we, I think, very quickly began to discover was that we were really missing a sort of broader fabric of community safety efforts in the district that really linked across not just kind of 911 mental health crisis, but also what does this mean for the kinds of services that we're providing to our unhoused populations? How are we thinking about the intersections with domestic or gendered violence? How are we understanding the intersections with community violence intervention? And I hope you're all going to be able to join us tomorrow at, sorry, I have to look at my calendar to remember that it is at 12 p.m. For the second part of this community safety ecosystem series with a conversation that's being led by the DC Justice Lab and Peace for DC. And so we realized that this conversation was I think much broader than just kind of who is responding to 911 calls for that are related to crisis. And so we wanted to pull together this conversation to try to unpack some of what that means and should mean for the district. As we think about these sorts of leadership transitions, thinking about a real opportunity for us to build what it is that we actually really think that we need, right? And so I wanted to just start there as a sort of a general framing for the conversation, and now pitch it over to Kylie or Rebecca or Jesse, whoever wants to jump in first, which is, when we think about community safety, all of these things that the city can be doing to keep neighborhoods safe without just having to rely on enforcement, without having to rely um, on policing as being the sort of only lever that we can pull. What's sort of getting in the way here in the district? Because it's people always talk about DC being resource rich and coordination poor, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about coordination today. But just when you think big picture, what's getting in the way of the district developing really successful community safety approaches that we're seeing other cities, Baltimore, Boston, Albuquerque, Durham, really start to see success with? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first pass. So I'm a researcher by training. My background is in public health, and one of the things that always comes to mind for me is just the importance of taking what we call a public health approach to violence and safety. And what we see in a lot of other cities that Tahir has given the great examples of is that they have taken that approach. And what that means is thinking about not just the risk factors or the things that are actually causing harm, but what are the preventive factors that we can have that can just stop harm and promote safety? And so in public health, we think about what we call the social determinants of health. So those conditions where people live and work and play. And when we're at the community safety level, we're really thinking about like the neighborhood and larger community. And so one of the things that I think that immediately comes to mind is just this lack of or this disinvestment in communities. Research has shown that there's this really strong relationship between safety in place and economic opportunity. And so when you have places where there is extreme or concentrated poverty, where there is systemic issues such as like segregation, or I talked about disinvestment, that's where we see the most challenges with safety, I'll say.
I would say I'm a social worker by trade, so I would look at more of the individual approach too of like what does safety mean to me versus what does safety mean to someone who's sleeping on the street, knowing that safety is equally important to everyone, no matter, and even more so for someone who is sleeping on the street. And so, I think it's really important because there's so much brokenness within the different systems, within different people groups, I mean, just so much brokenness all across the board where we can't even begin to understand, oh, what, like my safety is most important, what I believe is most important. And I think what we need to really do is, assess and get to know our neighbors, especially the ones that are different from us or in a different socioeconomic status, from different cultures, like get to know what safety means to them and why, because they might have a very different definition, and we won't be able to find um, really build a safe community for everyone if our definition of safety is just for one people group.
Yeah, I love that, Jesse, because it's so important, right? When we talk about community safety, I think sometimes folks think that we are referring to um, a smaller but sometimes really loud group of people who feel unsafe all the time, right? And that and that we discount sometimes um the ways in which a whole bunch of other people might feel unsafe for different reasons, or whose safety we don't actually really discuss as part of these public conversations, right? Whose lack of safety we maybe leave behind closed doors. Kylie, I don't know, maybe it's a good opportunity for you to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, I also like, right, I love that idea of what an individual's definition of safety is, but also I think really finding out what are the driving forces for disruption for different populations,
Mm.
right? Um, I love, Rebecca, that you talked about like data and research because I think that's a big part of it. In just thinking about like where the police get involved in domestic violence, it's usually about 14,000 family disturbance calls, which is where no crime has really occurred, versus about 9,000 where there is a crime that occurred. And I think if we really find some way to get in, I think some of those calls are certainly people who they anticipate that violence is going to happen and they're reaching out for help before it happens. But I think it's also just what's driving the stress in the household. And I think one of the things I often think about is just taking the opportunity, particularly if you know something maybe a particular address or family is really driving a lot of calls. Let's go talk outside of a crisis moment, right? We know there was this response, there was a crisis that triggered something. How do we follow up when everybody is in a little bit of better headspace and say, well, how did we get here in the first place? And then trying to resource that, which budget times. So I don't know what the rest of you that is meaningful to me. Um, and I will say the one other thing in thinking about the coordination piece, that administrative work just is not valued in the same way as kind of direct service work or resourced in the same way. I think obviously when budgets are tight, we focus in on providing the things, the tangible things to the people, but we really lose out on the other side and what makes us more efficient as a collective or creating a whole approach too.
Yeah, Kylie, I think that last piece is, I think, reflective of, this major shift that at some point we're going to have to make if we actually really want to get at solving the problem, which is that when we think about enforcement approaches, we do resource that administrative piece, right? When we think about law enforcement and, MPD, other law enforcement agencies, we do resource people taking time to do investigations, connecting the dots, figuring out, okay, what are the patterns that are at play here? Um, I think the problem is that at the end of the day, the tool that they actually have is still enforcement, which I think can only be limited. But if we are really serious about going upstream, then these community safety approaches need to be resourced in the same sort of way, which is that we have to figure out a little bit more of, finding folks who can spend time figuring out the patterns, right? Understanding these sort of overlapping, right? And I mean, it is no accident, right, that we have, Jesse is here from Pathways, we have Kylie from DC Safe. Tomorrow we're having community violence intervention as a conversation, right? We could on this call, we could have behavioral health professionals, we could have mental health, right? There's all of these different pieces, and I think what has really hurt us is having folks kind of working in silos, right? And, not with the sort of like coordination that if we want to throw somebody in jail, we figure out how to coordinate. And by the way, we resource it, right? Nobody's like, hey, sorry, we don't have enough money to, get guns off the street, right? But if we say, hey, we'd like to prevent domestic violence, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't know if we have enough money for that. And that to me feels like the kind of shift that we just have to figure out how to make. Rebecca, can I come back to you to say a little bit more, maybe in the context of the conversation that we've been having? You talked about risk factors and protective factors, right? And maybe just for folks who are a little bit unfamiliar, maybe dig in a little bit into like what those are and what they mean. And also like how do we take some of these public health ideas and start implementing them as part of not just DC government, but right as part of a sort of a unified approach to community safety.
Yeah, when we start thinking about like some of these risk factors, both kind of at the individual as well as the neighborhood or community level, like exposure to trauma in the home is one at the individual level that is a strong predictor of violence or experiences of unsafety. We also think about like the structural things like structural racism, over policing. We also think about disinvestment where there are vacant properties or where there hasn't been a lot of place-based investment. Those are the types of things that are risk factors. When we think about protective factors, it's having those strong relationships in communities. So knowing your neighbors and trusting your neighbors, having those pro-social relationships, having the supports that you need for mental and behavioral health. So really thinking about when we're thinking about protective factors, a lot of those upstream approaches that we can use before a violent incident, before a crisis has occurred. And so remind me of the second part of your question. Sorry.
Oh man, yeah, I'm not gonna remember. Jesse, Kylie, do you remember? I think. Oh, I was trying to right. How do we actually think about like what it looks like to implement these kinds of approaches in, a municipality, right? In a city, right? Because I think that we do talk about these things often, and I think again in our own sort of silos. I'm sure Kylie can talk about protective factors and risk factors. I'm sure Jesse can do the same. Um, but what does it mean to be thinking about that from maybe a sort of unified approach, right? In a city?
Yeah, and so in a past life, I worked in city government, and so I always pull from that experience. A lot of that looks like investing in things like youth and workforce development, investing in community development, and making sure that we are addressing blight. So a lot of it comes from coordination of services, like we talked about earlier, and making sure that there is that nice transfer of care. But it also comes from like true investments in people as well as in the conditions in their community.
Yeah. We my guess is many folks who are on the call will be aware of the permanent youth curfew that was passed by the council. And when the council was originally debating the temporary youth curfew, there were all these conversations about, well, we need other things, right? We need alternatives, even from folks who were in favor of the curfew. Um, and 6 months later, 9 months later, it feels like a conversation that we've been having for years in DC. I mean, how many youth curfews have we passed in DC, despite the fact that they haven't really seemed to do much of anything. We continue to kind of have this conversation over and over again. And every time we have the conversation, people say, "Oh, well, this is what we need. This is what we need." One of the recommendations that we make in the blueprint is to create a deputy city administrator of public safety and community safety, right? Somebody who is really at the highest levels of government thinking about community safety and who is responsible for leading work to develop that sort of larger strategy, right? That it shouldn't fall on, some random person at DPW to come up with a good idea for like a youth night, right? That's the kind of thing that we should be thinking about again, in the same way that, when there is when crime goes up 2%, it's like an all of government approach to think about how do we get guns off of the street. Um, we don't really take those same kind of approaches when it comes to the sort of overall strategies. Okay, I guess that was more of a comment than a question. So let me pivot back to another sort of question. Um, and maybe I'll send this one to Jesse first. Um, when you think about your world, what are we failing to do right now in the district that you kind of think could be game changing, right? Like if we took this seriously, we actually really could like wake up in a city that feels different than it did yesterday.
Um, oh, that's tough. I think in the last 11 years that I've been working with individuals experiencing homelessness, I think the mental health has significantly gotten worse. And that mixed especially this year with no housing, no new housing vouchers coming online for permanent supportive housing. I think that we're seeing a lot more folks who, I mean, each day that you're living on the street, you are surviving. And so you are not able to take care of your basic needs, let alone your mental health. And so I think that what we need a lot more mental health support, and a way to engage folks who are resistant in a healthy holistic way as well, to, not forcing something, but like what is the barrier that we're facing and how can we kind of break that barrier down? Uh, And then on like a whole nother level, just how we've moved in the last few months to very much policing homelessness, even though it's not been passed as illegal to sleep on the street. It has people are being forced out of almost everywhere there where they've slept. And so our office is right next to Martin Luther King Library, and it's kind of like the last major encampment. And I really think if we had more dedicated resources. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to a lot. But some more compassion from everyone too to understand that like it takes time. It just takes time. Some of these people have been out here for decades. And I think we're a city also that brings a lot of people with political delusions. And so there's like an extra layer of like, I'm not moving until I'm living in the White House. And it's like, okay, how I might take you, you maybe should go there. No. But just there's so many layers. And so I think a lot more resources, specifically mental health, but then housing, definitely, and that more collaboration because it's become such a policing issue and there's just a lot more fear than I've ever seen um, with my team as well as the folks that are sleeping on the street. Like everyone is a lot more fearful. Um, I don't really know if that answers or I just thought of more problems.
Well, look, the problems are definitely out there. Kylie, what do you think?
I mean, resources, I don't think can be said enough. I think particularly housing leaves people, like the lack of housing or any challenges getting in and out of housing leaves people so vulnerable. Um, I do also think there's a real moment here to talk about what some of the driving forces of violence are in terms of people who cause harm, both in terms of having some solutions and options for them that are outside the courthouse or outside the criminal justice system, which right now, if you're talking about some sort of domestic violence specific classes or interventions, that's really your only route. And so what can we have out there that we can offer before we get to that point? I think also realizing that domestic violence isn't just a simple kind of, I think, speaking to what you were talking about, Jess, like there's so many different ways this manifests. But I think one of the things that I have learned over many years of leading our lethality assessment project, where we're really looking at levels of risk in relationship, is there is a much smaller population really driving some of the worst violence and the most persistent violence. How do we focus in and really think about addressing that smaller population? Because I think especially when we think about scarcity, trying to dig in to where we see the most, like who's doing the most harm, and not just in one relationship, but right, everyone, why do they leave? Why do they leave? Well, they leave and that person goes out and gets a new girlfriend. And so like if we don't do anything there, then we've helped one person, but we haven't really solved it. And I don't think that has really been on the menu, or really a lot of deep thought in that space.
Yeah, and can you maybe say something as to why and I saw in an article in the 51st yesterday that uh, uh, um, that Mayor Bowser and Janine Pirro are proposing, stricter carceral penalties, right, for abusers. Can you say a little bit more about why that's not the answer, or if it is the answer, right, to solving this problem?
I mean, I think the legislation, we've actually been having some conversations about it, actually really is trying to dig into people who are just repeatedly going after someone. So you got arrested and you were told not to come back and you came back and you committed another crime, or you had an order of protection and then you decided to violate it, and you're going to keep violating it. And I do think, I don't. I do think there's some space there to kind of put up the red card and say, like, you got to sit this out for a little bit.
Mm.
I don't, I think there is some emerging research on new approaches to intervention for abusive partners out there, but I don't think it's an area where there's a lot of money and a lot of research. And so I know DC, I think, uses the Duluth model classes, which have been around forever. There's not a lot of money out there to say, like, how effective is that? And then, should we still be doing this approach? And to experiment, right? We're not going to know until we try some things. The funding is not there.
Yeah, yeah. One of the questions that I had was what would you like to see us experiment with? Because it does, I think much of the last couple of years has often felt too much like we're trying to play, trying to play defense, trying to keep our funding, trying to not, roll backwards, and it hasn't left us with as much space as we might want. And I hazard a guess that that's by design to experiment with other ways of doing things. I'm starting to see some questions flow into the chat, please, or I'm sorry, into the Q&A. So please keep those coming. The first one I really like. I think it's a tough one, but can we talk a little bit about how we model some of the kinds of behaviors, right? I think, Jesse, you started off by talking about safety and people's perceptions of safety. And in some ways, I think that we might all have a role to try to model the sort of pro-social behaviors that we'd like to see at a local level, knowing your neighbors, knowing your block, understanding your neighborhood. um, I think like the commenter, I love that idea, but also can find it really hard to practice in DC, and elsewhere because capitalism, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm like on my way to work, right? Or it feels like I have so little time. And so I'm curious for anybody how you think about those kinds of pro-social behaviors and what we can do as a community to take more responsibility for helping our neighborhoods feel safe. Is this just too hard of a question?
I think one of the things that's interesting is just like the idea of just saying something and being willing to, whether that's like, hey, how you doing? Or it sounded like things got loud last night. We actually just hosted a luncheon, and one of the things we really talked about was allies in the field of domestic violence and how important it is for people to speak up, whether you're talking to your friend or your coworker when you see something that's not right, right? To be vocal in where you stand and to put that in action. So I think just small things like that. I think Jesse thinking about kind of the homeless population in DC and the tendency for people to just be afraid and call 911 and run away rather than being like, are we all right? Right? Or call an alternative number. 911's so easy, like that's what they do. Like but there are options out there.
Any other thoughts?
I think awareness raising also, we have really great ANCs in the district, a lot of ways to get connected, but a lot of folks don't know the process of how to get to those meetings, where they are, where to find information about them. I think they are very powerful resources in our neighborhoods. And so I think there needs to be some additional awareness raising about those types of supports in communities that really help strengthen relationships in neighborhoods, and just getting awareness out about those.
Um, I think one of the things that I find myself sort of struggling with is the role of individuals as well as like the role of like the government, right? Because in a lot of ways, I find myself compelled by this idea of like we keep us safe, right? And like it should be on us. But at the same time, like somebody, a woman who used to work at Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. She said something to me about crisis that just really, really has been sticking with me lately. I feel like I've said it to everybody that I know in the last few months, which is that a crisis is just when anybody is beyond their own personal capacity to help, right? And that if somebody is having a heart attack on the street, right? We're not like, well, why don't you know how to fix that heart attack, right? We was like we resource and call professionals to like come in and ideally like do follow-up support. Again, it's not to say that the medical system is not without its own flaws. Um, but it makes me sort of think that like why aren't we treating these other sorts of crises with the same degree of urgency. So I'm kind of curious, right? One of the things that obviously we end up recommending in the blueprint is that we create that we really uplift and create a set of community crisis responders who can respond to a variety of different sorts of crises in the district, who can be deployed through 911 so that when people call 911 because they are stretched kind of beyond their capacity, that ideally there's somebody who is properly trained, is the right kind of person who can show up and help. And I'm just curious about how y'all think about that sort of balance of, what is it that the district should be providing? What is it that should be kind of on us as individuals to be sort of handling?
I'm not sure I think the line is different for everyone, but I think that I think it is our role to help shape how we want our whatever system to look like and what safety looks like. And so I think that takes advocacy, that takes a lot of research, that takes a lot of manpower behind everything too. And so I I think if we just left it up to the government to make decisions for everything, it would, yeah, we don't need to go down that road. But anyway, we I think we are equipped in a way that the government isn't to produce ideas and innovation um, that they don't necessarily always see because we're bringing in so many different people from different um, groups and walks of life and um, perspectives. And so I think it's our role to help shape and provide some ideas and really get behind and push those ideas too. Um, yeah.
I do wonder if maybe to that point, there's something to um, asking ourselves whether we actually are beyond our capacity in this moment, right? That I do think that there's maybe sometimes a sort of reflexiveness to be like, who else can solve this problem for me without sort of necessarily thinking, right, let's set aside whether or not it is a problem or not. But right, like who else can I call? As opposed to like maybe it is, hey, this is actually something that I can help with, and like asking that sort of question, question ourselves. Um, Another question that came in through the chat, we talked earlier about curfews, right? And I think that this sort of prioritizing law enforcement, thinking about curfews, um, it doesn't seem in keeping with kind of generally progressive approaches. But it's been really, really sticky, right? I think another commenter pointed out that we've had youth curfew for basically much of the last 30 years, right? And so, how do we do a better job of sort of challenging this curfew, right? From a narrative perspective, right? From a sort of storytelling perspective. What is it that's made this kind of approach, do you think? And I fully recognize that, we don't necessarily have dedicated youth advocates on the horn here, but I'm just curious from your perspective how you think about this sort of narrative because it feels kind of one and the same to so many of the other problems that we're talking about, right? I mean, we've not been able to develop the right sorts of narrative around unhoused populations. I feel like we've got really distorted narratives around domestic violence, and we've got really distorted narratives around mental health crisis. How do we change these?
I think I always go back to data, one, the right type of data, and then how we talk about it, making sure that we're not just throwing information at folks, particularly our policymakers, but really thinking about what are the ways that we can present this data that make it tangible and make folks see like what's in it for me. So that involves like some of the qualitative storytelling pieces that you're talking about, but also beefing up some of that quantitative data that we need to collect as well. So for me, I always go back to supporting what we're trying to do with some data.
Yeah, the other thing I was really just thinking is I think we kind of go to a curfew, go to law enforcement because it's a like a quick fix. And I think some of it is changing the narrative of let's not pretend that complex problems get solved overnight, right? We have to have some patience for ourselves and recognize that like the same patience you would expect in a crisis, you wouldn't expect something to happen to you and you'd be better tomorrow. How do we have patience for our fellow people and realize that there's nuance? I think that's like my favorite thing about being an advocate is I get to see the whole person and recognize that there's like a process of change and it's not going to be just one thing overnight. How we get, I think particularly right now in a culture where everything is like a 30-second sound bite or like a 2-minute story, how do we go back to actually having some narrative, like and some background? Because I think that's critical if we're going to get any better.
Yeah, complex problems rarely have simple solutions, and it does feel like people are reaching for a simple solution that essentially, hides the problem, right? And I mean, I think that's something certainly that we see in the unhoused context, something that we see in the mental health context. I know a lot as well. Um, Maybe along those lines, right? It feels like we don't do a good enough job of recognizing the role of victimization and how it overlaps with all kinds of crises, right? Domestic conflict, mental health, substance use, homelessness. What are we missing here, I think, as policymakers in particular, right? I mean, I understand that, right, from a narrative perspective, kind of what we're missing. What are we missing, especially for policymakers, right? Especially for, you know, new city council members, right? New mayors, right? New leaders of city agencies. What do we think that they're missing and how do we pivot?
One of the things that came up in the blueprint was actually making sure that survivors are part of the solution, that we're not just thinking about them as the afterthought. So actually bringing them into those city council meetings as you're advocating for specific policies, but really centering their voices and making sure that whatever solutions that we're thinking of are actually coming from the people who are most impacted.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly helpful because, oftentimes I think that people will say that they are survivor centered, um, but the moment that the lines start to get blurry and those survivors themselves do something that we don't like, then now actually we're like, we're done with you, right? And you're no longer sort of part of the conversation. And I think that there's an instinct there that I think is really, really deep and dark, and it's kind of within people's hearts. And I feel like I see it in like Instagram comments, and people just can't wait for somebody to get theirs without recognizing that, getting theirs might mean that, we're actually going after yesterday's survivor. Sort of a thing. Um, um, One other question, that I'm thinking about that sort of overlaps there, and maybe Jesse, this one for you. I I think that people oftentimes create this sort of story in their head that like mental health crises and homelessness are the same thing, right? They're kind of one and the same, and that we need to treat one, treat the other. That if we're treating one, that we're treating the other. And I think it's a complete misreading of like what's actually going on. Can you say a little bit more, or can you say a little bit around, you know, what you're seeing as like actual like best practice when it comes to homeless outreach within the sort of within the context and outside of the context of mental health.
Yeah, and I think the question too about um how often are we seeing direct homeless outreach specific to licensed professionals just responding to crises? I'd say um we have a not everyone is licensed. The majority of outreach workers are not licensed. And so I think there is definitely a response to crises in those moments. What a lot of our staff do are building rapport, and that is the most important thing. And when you are part of a people group that for the most part are invisible or outcasted, that is just as important. And that's the first step that we really need before someone can even think about seeking treatment for mental health or substance use. And yeah, I do think that whenever someone sees someone on the sidewalk or in an alley or something, I think everyone thinks, oh, they must be addicted to something or have mental health issues, problems, anything. Like you already put that label on someone. And I think um there's so many more people that are working, holding down jobs, that are like providing for their families, that are like doing anything they can, and they cannot afford to live in this city, and they've been pushed out. They've been here for their families have been here for generations. They lost their family's house, and now they're on the street. Like there's so many stories that people just don't know because they don't take the chance to get to know someone. And also a lot of those people, like we do, people are working during the day, and so they might just come to sleep outside at night, and then they're going to the library to shower and change, or going into a Starbucks to clean up, and then going on their way. And so they don't even get, some of these people are also missed because they're not, you know, around during the day. And so I think there's a lot more educating that we need to do, especially in a city where the loudest voices make movement, and a lot of, like you said, a lot of it's a smaller group. I think there's a lot more people who are compassionate and care, but there's a lot of noise, especially in downtown, and I know like some of the other more wealth concentrated areas where it's there's not an understanding of the human that is behind the person that's sleeping on the ground.
Yeah, in some ways, I wonder if, kind of going back to the conversation that we were having earlier about kind of our responsibilities. I wonder if some of our responsibility is to be more annoying with policymakers, right? Like I think the people who want the sort of simple solutions, who want, every problem to be resolved by, calling 911 or, involving a set of handcuffs, those people are annoying, right? They're calling, they're in constituent services emails, they're, showing up to council, and, we're maybe hoping that calmer heads will prevail. And I just wonder if we have to be, I'm not telling you to be really annoying, but maybe a little bit, maybe just a little bit annoying. Um, to our participants, please give us any more questions that you've got. Would love to try to reserve as much of these last 10 minutes for additional Q&A if we could. In the meantime, um, one more question that I'll send that I'll send out. You know, said earlier today that DC has this kind of consistent refrain of resource rich and coordination poor. Um, where are you seeing that lack of coordination showing up in your work and making your work less effective? Because I do think that a lot of folks will look at the district budget and look at how much money we are spending and say, you guys are asking for more resources, but oh my gosh, right? Like, look at how much we're spending, and it doesn't feel like we're actually getting that much from it. So, what in the way of coordination would you like to see, a new district government do better in 2027?
I think a lot of challenges that we face is the coordination between Department of Behavioral Health when when police are called versus the community response team and then who comes out. And for us, we will call, and oftentimes it's they're tied up with other crises, and then the police get diverted, and we'll ask for a CIO officer, which is a crisis intervention officer. And if we get one, we get one. If we don't, we don't. Um, and then let's say someone is taken, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, for mental health reasons. There's a lot of work that I think needs to be done on coordinating outside of that, because what happens is that person is then assessed by a medical professional, and they deem in that moment, is that person a threat to themselves or others, or they are assessing them in that exact moment. And so they don't always have the history that we have of that client. And so a lot of times it's just this cycle, and I don't think there's anyone at fault. It's a systemic issue that we need to change. But just trying to figure out the coordination more so that someone's not just going into the hospital psych ward for a few hours or to PIW for 2 days and then being released, and then their stuff has been thrown away. We're trying to find them. They're disoriented. Like I just there's yeah, and who knows, who did police take them? Did they go with, DBH? Did they? So I think that is, I would love to see more coordination and how to make sure that if someone is going to be involuntarily committed or go to PIW or CPAP or anything, that we have a stronger system in place to support that individual. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think like flexibility of services too. Like I think I often see like someone may come to us like domestic violence may be part of how somebody ended up in a PIW or on a hold somewhere. And they're kind of let out and it's like, okay, well, here are your appointment dates and show up at that time. And is that we're treating someone like they're in a totally normal space when they just are not. So we have to be able to be flexible. Like, are you really able to get here? Would it be easier if I sent someone to you? Like just something that simple. I think there's also a lot of concern around kind of confidentiality, and I think that plays a huge role and is something that really needs to be respected. But letting it get in the way of some of the practical connections you need to make to get someone care, I think can really like tie people up and make it impossible for them to get what they need.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it feels like each of these are the kinds of things that um we need personnel, right? I think we mentioned in a conversation the other day that like some of this is about the administrative like investment to do the coordination, right? That like we can't just be obsessed with like funding outcomes. We have to fund also the people who are going to help make those outcomes more effective, more efficient, more lasting. And that might mean data people. It might mean just somebody who's like focusing on connecting the dots. It might mean, hey, we're actually going to invest the time that it takes to figure out data sharing across agencies. Even though, like, yes, it's hard, but that it's not impossible, right? But if we won't fund the people to actually figure it out, then like, yeah, it's just going to remain this thing that sits um on the um on the horizon. Um, all right. Last question, just a very quick wrap-up question. What gives you hope, right? Things are tough out there in the world. What is sparking hope for you here on May 6th, 2026?
For me, it's these conversations, people like you all, this community, and then also when people do move into housing and you see them succeed and you see them thrive and they come back and then they are wanting to be an advocate for other folks on the street. And so, yeah, I think that definitely people who care and also the people who are actually like in it and have gone through it, lived through really horrific experiences and come out the other side and are so much more joyful than so many other people. So, yeah.
Into that. Love that, Jesse. Got to do it better. We have to all do a better job of uplifting those stories because I think people assume that all of these problems are intractable, right? And that whoever somebody is at their worst moment or at their deepest, lowest moment is just like who that person has always been and will always and will always be. Kylie, Rebecca.
I mean, it's interesting we were talking about narrative shifts, and I do think I am definitely seeing some of that. I actually train over at the Police Academy new recruits, and I've been doing it for like 7+ years. And just the way people talk about kind of some of the common myths and misconceptions out there, like I am seeing a pivot. I think there's a lot more work to be done. But I think there is. I think also just as we are going through budget season and kind of to echo what we were talking about in terms of getting involved, I see people show up. I see 100 people go to testify about MPD. I see 100+ people testifying today about the Office of Victim Services and Justice grants. It's a city where you can show up, and I this year I've really seen people show out, and that does give me heart.
Amazing. Rebecca, close
I
us.
would,
Close.
yeah, I would say +1 to all of that. I don't think I have too much more to add. Like you said at the beginning, we know that these types of approaches work, right? We've seen this happen in other cities. And to my panelists' other points, like the desire, the drive from folks in community is there to make this work. And so I'm just hopeful because we know this works and it's very doable in a district.
Wonderful. Kylie, Rebecca, Jesse, so grateful for you. Also, so grateful for my team who helped put this together. Susan Bales, our senior fellow, Mariela Ruiz, Angel, my director of alternative response initiatives. Really grateful for your support and for all of your organizations. Okay, everyone, go to Real Happy Hour now. But before you do, please make sure to join us tomorrow for DC Safe, I'm sorry, DC Justice Lab and Peace for DC's conversation about community violence intervention. And if you haven't yet, please look at Our Neighborhoods, Our Safety, a blueprint for a unified public health approach to community safety on our website. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Peace.
everyone.
Thanks.